The portrait of young William Whitmore had been painted with his customary solemn expression, but when Mrs. Holloway passed by the grand hall at midnight, candle in hand, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The boy in the portrait was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end. London, 1893. The Whitmore estate stood at the edge of Hampstead Heath, its Gothic spires and sprawling gardens a testament to generations of aristocratic wealth. The death of Lord Richard Whitmore the previous winter had cast a pall over the household, leaving his 9-year-old son William as the sole heir to the Whitmore fortune. The boy had always been a quiet, serious child, but grief had rendered him nearly silent, his eyes holding a melancholy far beyond his years. It was Lady Catherine Whitmore who commissioned the portrait, hoping to capture some spark of her son before childhood slipped away entirely. "He needs this," she explained to Mrs. Holloway, the stern Scottish governess who had managed the household for 15 years. "Something to remind him of who he is, of his place in the family lineage." Mrs. Holloway had her doubts. The boy needed companionship and fresh air, not to sit motionless for hours under the scrutiny of some fashionable artist. But it wasn't her place to question Lady Catherine, especially now when the woman was so fragile herself. The artist selected for the commission was Ambrose Sheffield, whose portraits of society children had become quite fashionable among London's elite. Sheffield was a tall, thin man with piercing eyes and long fingers perpetually stained with paint. He arrived at the Whitmore estate on a gloomy Tuesday morning, his supplies carried by a silent assistant who vanished as soon as the equipment was arranged in the conservatory. "Perfect light here," Sheffield declared, studying young William with an intensity that made Mrs. Holloway uncomfortable. "The greenery will make a splendid backdrop for the young master's complexion." The sittings were scheduled for every afternoon from 1 until 4, when the light in the conservatory was at its best. William endured them with stoic resignation, sitting perfectly still in his best suit, his expression never changing from one of dignified solemnity. "Couldn't you smile just a little?" Mrs. Holloway overheard Sheffield ask on the 3rd day. "A hint of joy would bring such life to your features." "Whitmores don't smile for portraits," William replied, his voice soft but firm. "Father said it shows weakness of character." Sheffield's own smile faltered at this, but he continued painting without further comment. As the weeks progressed, Mrs. Holloway noticed subtle changes in the artist's demeanor. He began arriving earlier, staying later, his conversations with Lady Catherine growing longer and more intimate. Sometimes, passing by the conservatory after William had been dismissed, she would catch snippets of their discussion. "And the boy has such depth in him," Sheffield said once. "I've never seen such potential in a subject. It's as if there's someone else looking out from behind those eyes." "William has always been an old soul," Lady Catherine replied, her voice tinged with pride and something else. Was it apprehension? The portrait took longer than expected, nearly 6 weeks instead of the anticipated 3. Sheffield became obsessive about details, working and reworking certain elements while muttering to himself. Mrs. Holloway noticed he paid particular attention to the eyes, often mixing his paints with substances from small vials he kept in a locked wooden box. "Special pigments," he explained when he caught her watching. "From the East. They capture more than just appearance. They capture essence." On the final day, Sheffield worked until well after sunset, illuminating his canvas with a circle of strange blue-flamed candles that filled the conservatory with a sweet, heavy scent. When he finally declared the work complete, he insisted on hanging it himself in the grand hall, muttering what sounded like Latin phrases as he secured it to the wall. "The portrait must be appreciated from different lights throughout the day," he explained. "The impression changes, you see, as light moves across the canvas, rather like the subject himself." William, present for the unveiling, showed no reaction to his painted self. The portrait was undeniably skillful. The boy stood against a backdrop of lush greenery, his posture perfect, his expression appropriately solemn. His eyes, though Mrs. Holloway thought they seemed somehow more alive than the rest of the painting, as if they might blink at any moment. "It's perfect," Lady Catherine declared, though something in her voice suggested uncertainty. "It is more than perfect," Sheffield replied with a peculiar emphasis. "It is true." That night, after the household had retired, Mrs. Holloway made her customary rounds, checking windows and doors before retiring herself. As she passed through the grand hall, her candle cast shifting shadows across the newly hung portrait. She nearly dropped the candlestick when she saw it. William's painted face had changed. His solemn expression was gone, replaced by a smile so wide it seemed to stretch beyond the natural limits of his face. His eyes, too, seemed different, wider, more intense, focused directly on her. Mrs. Holloway raised her candle higher, certain it was a trick of the light. But the higher she lifted it, the more pronounced the smile became, the teeth too numerous, too sharp. "Lord preserve us," she whispered, backing away. As she retreated, she could have sworn the eyes of the portrait followed her movement, the smile widening incrementally with each step she took. Sleep eluded Mrs. Holloway that night. She told herself it had been imagination, a combination of shadows and her own fatigue. But when she rose before dawn to begin her duties, an inexplicable dread filled her at the thought of passing through the grand hall. She took the servants' corridor instead, but curiosity eventually overcame fear. Mid-morning, when sunlight streamed through the hall's tall windows, she found an excuse to pass by the portrait. In daylight, it was exactly as it had been at the unveiling. William stood solemn and dignified, no trace of a smile on his thin lips. Foolishness, she chided herself, and getting old and fanciful. Yet that night, making her final rounds, she deliberately took the longer route to avoid the grand hall entirely. It was the next morning when the first strange incident occurred. William's valet found the boy's clothes scattered about his room, though William himself was still fast asleep in bed. What made it peculiar was that the clothes had been neatly laid out the night before, and now they were not merely moved, but arranged in a bizarre pattern on the floor, almost like the outline of a person. Sleepwalking, perhaps, Lady Catherine suggested when Mrs. Holloway reported the incident. His father did the same as a child. It runs in the family. But Mrs. Holloway had her doubts. She had cared for William since infancy and had never known him to sleepwalk. And there were other small disturbances. Objects moved from their usual places, doors left open that had been closed, the faint sound of laughter echoing through empty corridors in the dead of night. The most troubling change, however, was in William himself. The perpetually serious boy had begun to display flashes of a personality Mrs. Holloway had never seen before. Moments of mischief, outbursts of inappropriate laughter, and once, a cruel, practical joke played on one of the kitchen maids that left the poor girl in tears. "It's not like him," Mrs. Holloway confided to Mr. Peterson, the elderly butler. "It's as if he's become two different children. One moment our quiet, well-mannered William, the next a stranger I hardly recognize." "Children change," Peterson replied with a shrug, "especially after trauma. The boy lost his father, after all." But Mrs. Holloway couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at work, especially after what she witnessed the following night. Unable to sleep, she had gone to the kitchen for warm milk, taking the route through the grand hall out of a determined effort to conquer her irrational fears. The full moon shone through the windows, illuminating the portrait in silvery light. The painted William was smiling again, that same too wide, too sharp smile that had haunted her thoughts. But worse, as she stood frozen in shock, She distinctly saw the eyes blink. Have you ever experienced something similar? Let us know in the comments. Mrs. Holloway fled back to her quarters, heart pounding in her chest. She told herself it was impossible. Paintings don't blink, don't change their expressions. Yet she knew what she had seen, and it wasn't the first time. You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of painted eyes watching her. By morning, Mrs. Holloway had resolved to speak with Lady Catherine about her concerns, irrational as they might seem. But when she arrived at breakfast, she found the household in disarray. William was missing. The valet had gone to wake him and found his bed empty, the covers thrown back as if he had risen in haste. A search of the grounds was quickly organized, with footmen dispatched to check the gardens, stables, and surrounding woods. Mrs. Holloway joined the search, a growing dread building within her. She found herself drawn to the grand hall, to the portrait that had so disturbed her. In the morning light, it appeared perfectly normal. William's solemn face gazing out with dignified composure. No hint of that terrible smile. A sound behind her made her turn. William stood in the doorway, still in his nightclothes, his hair tousled as if from sleep. "William," she exclaimed, rushing to him. "Where have you been? The entire household is searching for you." The boy looked confused. "In my room. Mrs. Holloway, where else would I be?" "Don't be ridiculous. Mr. Simmons checked your room not half an hour ago. You weren't there." William frowned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "I must have been in the washroom then. I've been feeling strange lately, like I'm not fully awake." Mrs. Holloway studied him carefully. There was something off about his demeanor, a slight difference in the way he held himself, the cadence of his speech. "Come along then," she said finally. "Let's get you dressed and inform your mother you've been found." As they passed the portrait, Mrs. Holloway noticed William pause, his gaze fixed on his painted likeness with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between fear and recognition. "Do you like it?" she asked carefully. "The portrait, I mean." William continued to stare at the painting. "It's not me," he said softly. "And not really." Before she could question him further, Lady Catherine appeared, her face lighting with relief at the sight of her son. "William, thank heavens!" She rushed forward, embracing him. "Where were you?" "Apparently in his room all along," Mrs. Holloway explained, watching William's face, "though Mr. Simmons insists he checked there thoroughly." Lady Catherine dismissed the inconsistency with a wave of her hand. "Well, he's here now. That's what matters. William, darling, go with Mrs. Holloway and get dressed. We'll discuss this over breakfast." As William allowed himself to be led away, Mrs. Holloway glanced back at the portrait. For a fraction of a second, she thought she saw that unnatural smile again, like a reflection in water disturbed by a passing breeze, there and gone so quickly she couldn't be certain. Over the following days, Mrs. Holloway kept careful watch over William. The boy's behavior continued to fluctuate in ways that increasingly concerned her. One moment, he was his usual quiet, thoughtful self. The next, he would display an almost feverish energy, his eyes bright with mischief, his laughter too loud and sharp-edged. These episodes always seemed worse after he spent time in the grand hall, near the portrait. Mrs. Holloway began keeping a journal, documenting the changes she observed. She noted that the portrait itself seemed to alter subtly throughout the day. In bright sunlight, it appeared entirely normal. But as shadows lengthened, the boy in the painting seemed to shift position slightly, his expression growing less solemn, more anticipatory. And at night, though she forced herself to check only occasionally, the portrait invariably displayed that horrible, too wide smile, the eyes alive with malevolent glee. One evening, as she recorded her observations by candlelight, a knock came at her door. It was Mr. Peterson, the butler, his usually impassive face creased with worry. "You should come," he said without preamble. "There's something wrong with the young master." Mrs. Holloway followed him to William's bedroom, where they found Lady Catherine sitting on the edge of her son's bed. William was awake but seemed dazed, his eyes unfocused, his body trembling slightly. "He was sleepwalking again," Lady Catherine explained in a hushed voice. "The night maid found him in the grand hall, standing before the portrait, talking to it." "Talking to it," Mrs. Holloway echoed, a chill running down her spine. "Conversing, as if with another person. When she approached, he wasn't himself." Lady Catherine hesitated. His voice was different, his entire manner. "He frightened poor Mary quite badly." Mrs. Holloway looked at William, who now seemed to be drifting back to sleep, his eyelids fluttering. "This isn't the first strange occurrence," she said carefully. "I've noticed changes in his behavior since the portrait was hung. And the portrait itself." She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate her impossible observations. Lady Catherine's face tightened. "The portrait itself." "What?" "Mrs. Holloway. It changes, my lady, at night, when no one is watching. The expression, it smiles." She expected disbelief, perhaps even anger at such a fantastical claim. Instead, Lady Catherine's face drained of color. "You've seen it too," she whispered. The admission hung in the air between them, a confirmation of fears too outlandish to voice until now. "What do we do?" Mrs. Holloway asked finally. Lady Catherine straightened her shoulders, decision crystallizing in her eyes. "We need help, someone who understands these matters better than we do." The following morning, Lady Catherine sent a telegram to Dr. Julian Sullivan, a former colleague of her late husband's known for his interest in unusual phenomena. She was deliberately vague about the nature of the problem, describing it only as a matter requiring your unique expertise regarding objects with unexplained properties. Dr. Sullivan arrived 2 days later, a short, robust man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. Despite his scholarly appearance, there was a sharpness to his gaze that suggested he was accustomed to looking beyond surface appearances. Lady Catherine received him in the morning room, with Mrs. Holloway present at her request. After preliminary pleasantries, Lady Catherine came directly to the point. "We have a situation, Dr. Sullivan, that defies rational explanation. It concerns a portrait recently painted of my son and certain disturbances that have followed its completion." "What kind of disturbances?" Sullivan asked, his tone neutral but attentive. Lady Catherine glanced at Mrs. Holloway, who took her cue to explain what she had witnessed: the changing expression in the portrait, William's altered behavior, the sleepwalking episodes. Sullivan listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound book. When Mrs. Holloway finished, he removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. "I'd like to see this portrait, if I may," he said, "and, if possible, speak with your son." "William is at his lessons now," Lady Catherine replied, "but the portrait is in the grand hall. I'll show you." As they approached the portrait, Sullivan's demeanor changed subtly. His casual academic air gave way to a more focused intensity. He studied the painting in silence for several minutes, occasionally consulting a small brass instrument that resembled a compass combined with a thermometer. "Most interesting," he murmured. "The technique is quite remarkable. This artist, Sheffield, you said, has a considerable reputation, I believe." "Yes, he's become quite fashionable among certain circles," Lady Catherine confirmed. Sullivan leaned closer to the canvas, examining the brushwork near William's eyes. "Are you familiar with his background?" "His training?" Lady Catherine shook her head. "Not in detail. He came highly recommended by the Harringtons, whose daughters he painted last season. I see. Sullivan straightened. And did he display any unusual methods during the painting process? Mrs. Holloway spoke up. He used special pigments, he said, from the East. And on the final day, he worked with strange blue candles arranged in a circle. Sullivan's eyebrows rose. Indeed, most illuminating. He made another note in his book. Lady Whitmore, I believe I may be able to help you, but I'll need to conduct further investigations. Would it be possible for me to remain overnight? I'd like to observe the portrait under various conditions, particularly after dark. Lady Catherine agreed readily, her relief at finding someone who took their concerns seriously evident in her manner. As they turned to leave, Mrs. Holloway glanced back at the portrait. For an instant, she could have sworn William's painted eyes had shifted to follow Dr. Sullivan's movements. A flicker of something, concern, anger, passing across the normally impassive features. That evening, after dinner, Sullivan requested time alone with the portrait. He set up various instruments around the grand hall and asked not to be disturbed until morning. Mrs. Holloway found sleep impossible, her mind racing with questions about what the doctor might discover. Around 2 in the morning, she gave up trying and decided to make herself a cup of tea in the kitchen. As she passed near the grand hall, she heard voices, Sullivan's deeper tone and another higher and childlike, yet somehow wrong, as if the cadence and inflection weren't quite human. Have you ever experienced something similar? Let us know in the comments. Mrs. Holloway froze in the corridor, torn between fear and curiosity. The childlike voice speaking with Dr. Sullivan wasn't William's, at least not the William she had known for 9 years. It had his timbre but carried an older cadence with unfamiliar inflections that sent chills down her spine. You won't believe what happened next. Watch until the end. Gathering her courage, she edged closer to the partially open door of the grand hall, careful to remain in shadow. Quite clever, Doctor, the childlike voice was saying. Most observers simply flee when they notice the changes. You're the first to actually attempt communication. I've encountered similar phenomena before, Sullivan replied, his tone remarkably calm. Though I must say, your manifestation is particularly strong. The artist who created this conduit must have been exceptionally skilled. Sheffield knew what he was doing, the voice agreed, now tinged with amusement. Though even he didn't fully comprehend what he was channeling, he thought himself in control of the process. Mrs. Holloway dared to peek around the doorframe. The sight that greeted her defied all rational explanation. Dr. Sullivan stood before the portrait, which was now illuminated by a strange, cold light that seemed to emanate from the canvas itself. The painted William was fully animated, the figure leaning forward within the confines of the frame as if it were a window rather than a flat surface. The horrible smile was in full evidence, stretching unnaturally wide across the painted face. "And what exactly are you?" Sullivan asked, making notes without looking down at his book. "You're draped a spirit, an elemental, something else entirely?" The painted figure tilted its head in a gesture that was both childlike and deeply unsettling. "Labels are so limiting, Doctor. Let's just say I'm an opportunity seeker. This family has such interesting history, such potential. The boy is a perfect vessel, young, malleable, and with such a deliciously tragic background. And what do you want with him?" The smile widened impossibly further, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp. "What any of us want, Doctor. Existence, experience. The painted world is so limiting. I've been patient, building my influence gradually. The boy resists, but children are naturally susceptible to suggestion. Each night, he comes to me. Each night, I become a little more real, and he becomes a little more accommodating." Mrs. Holloway must have made some small sound of distress, for the painted eyes suddenly shifted, looking directly at her hiding place. "Ah, we have company," the voice said, now tinged with malice. The faithful governess, so concerned for her charge. "Come in, Mrs. Holloway." No need to lurk in doorways. As if pulled by invisible strings, Mrs. Holloway found herself stepping into the grand hall. Dr. Sullivan turned, his expression grave. "Mrs. Holloway, you should not be here. This entity is dangerous." "Entity?" she whispered, unable to tear her gaze from the animated portrait. What is happening to William?" "Nothing that cannot be reversed," Sullivan assured her, positioning himself between her and the painting. "But we must act quickly. This presence has been using the portrait as a conduit to influence the boy. Each interaction strengthens its hold." The painted figure laughed, a sound like glass breaking in the distance. "Such confidence, Doctor, but you're already too late. The boy comes to me willingly now. Soon, the transition will be complete." "Transition?" Mrs. Holloway asked, her voice barely audible. Sullivan's face was grim. It's attempting to exchange places with William, to take physical form, while trapping him within the painting. The revelation struck Mrs. Holloway like a physical blow. All the strange behavior, the personality shifts, William's confusion about his whereabouts, it suddenly made terrible sense. "We must find William," she said urgently. "He could be in danger right now." As if in answer to her words, the door to the grand hall swung fully open. William stood in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted against the darkness of the corridor. He was in his nightclothes, eyes wide and unfocused, moving with the jerky, uncertain steps of a sleepwalker. "William," Mrs. Holloway cried, starting toward him. "Don't!" Sullivan warned. "That may not entirely be William anymore." The boy continued forward, his gaze fixed on the portrait. As he moved into the light, Mrs. Holloway could see that his expression was torn, part fear, part resignation, as if he were fighting some internal battle. "He calls to me," William said, his voice eerily similar to the one that had emanated from the portrait moments before. "Every night, in my dreams, he says we must become one." "Who calls to you, William?" Sullivan asked gently, cautiously approaching the boy. "He does. The other me, the one who was here before." William pointed at the portrait, which had reverted to its normal appearance the moment he had entered the room. "He says he's been waiting so long, trapped in painted worlds. He needs me to set him free." "And what do you want, William?" Sullivan asked, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "Not what he wants. What do you want?" William's expression flickered, a glimpse of his true self breaking through whatever influence held him. "I want him to leave me alone," he whispered. "I'm scared." "That's good, William. Hold on to that feeling. This is your life, your body. You have the right to refuse him entry." The portrait began to change again, the smile returning, more terrible than ever. A low hum filled the air, like the vibration of a massive bell struck at a distance. "Enough of this," the voice from the portrait snarled, all pretense of childish charm gone. "The boy is mine. We have an agreement." "No agreement made under duress is valid," Sullivan replied firmly, "especially not with a child." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small silver flask. Unscrewing the cap, he sprinkled its contents, a fine, glittering powder in a circle around himself and William. "Mrs. Holloway," he called, "bring Lady Catherine, quickly. The boy needs his mother's strength combined with his own to break this influence." As Mrs. Holloway turned to comply, the portrait seemed to bulge outward, the canvas stretching as if something were pushing against it from behind. The humming grew louder, and the temperature in the room plummeted until their breath fogged in the air. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the voice boomed, no longer remotely childlike. "The vessel has accepted me. The transition is underway." Indeed, William had begun to change before their eyes. His features seemed to blur, as if two faces were superimposed, his own and the terrible smiling visage from the portrait. He cried out in pain, clutching his head. Mrs. Holloway ran faster than she had in years, racing through the corridors to Lady Catherine's chambers. She burst in without knocking, finding her mistress already awake, sitting upright in bed as if she had been expecting the intrusion. "It's William," Mrs. Holloway gasped. "In the grand hall, Dr. Sullivan says he needs you. Something about breaking an influence." Lady Catherine needed no further explanation. She grabbed her dressing gown and followed Mrs. Holloway back through the house at a run. When they reached the grand hall, the scene had deteriorated further. The circle of powder Sullivan had created was now glowing with a pale blue light, barely containing the struggle within. William was on his knees, his body trembling violently as Sullivan knelt beside him, one hand on the boy's shoulder, the other holding what appeared to be an ancient medallion before William's eyes. The portrait on the wall had transformed completely. The canvas now showed an empty background. The painted William was gone. Instead, a shadowy figure pressed against the inside of the painting as if it were a window, hands splayed against an invisible barrier, that terrible smile now a snarl of rage. "Lady Catherine!" Sullivan called when he saw them. "Come quickly! Your son needs you." Lady Catherine rushed forward without hesitation, stepping into the glowing circle and dropping to her knees beside William. "What must I do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the impossible scene before her. "Hold him. Remind him who he is. The entity has been feeding on his grief, his sense of loss. It offered him escape from those feelings, but at a terrible price." Lady Catherine gathered her son into her arms. William's eyes fluttered open, but they were wrong somehow, the pupils unnaturally elongated, the irises flickering between their normal blue and an oily black. "Mother," he whispered, his voice thin and distant. I'm here, William," she replied, holding him tighter. "I've always been here. I know I've been distant since your father, since we lost him, but I never stopped loving you. I never will." "The painting man says the pain will stop if I go with him," William said, his voice childlike again. "He says I won't have to be sad anymore." "Oh, my darling," Lady Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "Sadness is part of life. We don't overcome it by escaping it, but by moving through it together." As she spoke, Sullivan removed a small vial from his case and unstoppered it. "This contains a tincture that will help break the entity's hold," he explained, "but William must take it willingly. He must choose to reject the entity's influence." Lady Catherine held the vial to her son's lips. "William, will you trust me? Will you let us help you?" For a terrible moment, William's face contorted with internal struggle, the other presence fighting for control. Then, with visible effort, he nodded and swallowed the tincture. The effect was immediate and dramatic. William's body went rigid, then relaxed completely as he exhaled a cloud of dark vapor that dissipated in the air. At the same moment, the portrait on the wall shuddered violently, the canvas rippling as if in a strong wind. The shadowy figure within let out a howl of rage that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It beat against the inside of the frame with increasing desperation as its form began to disintegrate, breaking apart like smoke in a storm. With a final, terrible cry, the entity vanished, leaving the portrait as it had originally been painted. William, standing solemn and dignified, no trace of that unnatural smile. The boy himself had collapsed in his mother's arms, exhausted but breathing normally, his features entirely his own again. "Is it over?" Mrs. Holloway asked, hardly daring to believe what she had witnessed. Sullivan nodded, though his expression remained grave. "The immediate danger has passed. The entity has been forced back into its painted prison and sealed there, but the portrait itself remains a potential conduit. Then we shall destroy it, Lady Catherine declared, still cradling her sleeping son. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Sullivan cautioned. Destroying the physical canvas might simply release the entity in another form. No, the portrait must be contained properly. In the days that followed, Dr. Sullivan worked with artisans to create a special case for the portrait. A box of lead-lined wood, inscribed with protective symbols and sealed with silver clasps. The painting was placed inside, wrapped in silk, soaked in holy water and various herbal preparations. It must never be displayed again, Sullivan instructed as workmen carried the sealed case down to the deepest cellar of the Whitmore estate. Ideally, it should be buried or immersed in running water, but if that's not possible, keeping it sealed and hidden will suffice. William recovered slowly, but steadily. The personality shift ceased entirely, though he retained no clear memory of his interactions with the entity. Lady Catherine, true to her word, became more present in her son's life, working through their shared grief together rather than apart. Mrs. Holloway remained with the family for many years afterward, eventually witnessing William grow into a fine young man, thoughtful and kind with no trace of that other terrible influence. The portrait remained sealed in its case, hidden away in the cellar and eventually forgotten by all but a few. When the Whitmore estate was sold in 1947, following the last heir's emigration to America, the new owners discovered the strange box during renovations. Intrigued by its unusual design and heavy locks, they opened it despite the warnings engraved on its surface. The portrait they found inside appeared perfectly ordinary, a solemn-faced Victorian boy against a backdrop of greenery. They hung it in their drawing room as an interesting historical curiosity. That night, the housekeeper reported hearing a child's laughter echoing through the empty corridors. And in the morning, visitors to the drawing room noted something odd about the antique portrait. The boy in the painting appeared to be smiling. If you want to hear more whispers from the darkness, follow this channel. The next story might be closer than you imagine.